Ron and Hermione Weasley. Let's start with the Granger Weasley family, the couple the entire Wizarding world had been waiting on since third year. Two people who spent so long arguing with each other that falling in love felt like the most natural conclusion imaginable. So, what happened after that kiss in the middle of the Battle of Hogwarts? They survived the war, celebrated, and did what any reasonable couple does after helping defeat a noseless Dark Lord. They got married. Ron and Hermione's wedding was, by all accounts, exactly what you would expect from these two. Hermione arrived prepared, composed, and probably with a backup plan for the backup plan. Ron got so drunk before the ceremony that his memory of the entire event was mostly hazy, and when asked if he would take Hermione as his wife, reportedly responded with, "I think I do." Romantic, truly romantic. The woman who would go on to become Minister for Magic said her vows to a man who was not entirely sure he was at the right wedding. Their entire relationship summarized in one afternoon. What makes their story interesting beyond the wedding is how differently their lives moved after it. Hermione went back to Hogwarts, finished her 7th year, sat her NEWTs, joined the Ministry, reformed magical creature rights legislation, dismantled pure-blood discrimination laws, rose through magical law enforcement, and eventually became Minister for Magic. Ron, meanwhile, joined the Auror office after the war, the magical world's version of law enforcement, hunting down dark wizards for a living. He lasted about 2 years before deciding that daily mortal danger was considerably less appealing without a prophecy forcing his hand, and left to help his brother George run Weasley's Wizard Wheezies. Two people from the same war, the same friendship, the same tent in the middle of nowhere, who ended up building completely different careers and somehow made it work anyway. They had 2 children, Rose and Hugo Granger Weasley, both sorted into Gryffindor, both carrying a hyphenated last name because Hermione had spent years fighting for equality and was not leaving her name out of her own family. Rose inherited her mother's academic intensity and her father's ability to walk into a room and immediately make people comfortable. Tipped by many as one of the brightest students of her generation, Hugo remains considerably less documented, possibly the most well-adjusted person in the entire extended family, a distinction that in this particular group is genuinely impressive. Hermione had restored her parents' memories in Australia shortly after the war, meaning Rose and Hugo grew up with devoted Muggle grandparents who became deeply embedded in their lives. Ron found the whole dynamic equal parts confusing and wonderful, which tracks perfectly for a man who once genuinely asked what a rubber duck was for. At some point, Ron decided he wanted to learn to drive a Muggle car and used a Confundus charm to pass the test rather than, actually studying for it. Hermione found out. Let's just say that a woman who had faced Voldemort, Death Eaters, and a year in a tent with no shower was somehow most tested by her husband's cheating on a Muggle driving exam. Ron's proudest moment, according to Rowling, was his chocolate frog card. Hermione is still processing that information and probably always will be. Harry and Ginny Potter. If you had told Harry Potter at 11 years old, sitting in a cupboard under the stairs wearing his cousin's hand-me-downs with no idea magic even existed, that one day he would have a wife, 3 kids, and a career catching dark wizards, he probably would have cried, in a good way. The boy who grew up with nothing but a life that had everything, and somehow still found a way to make it more complicated. Harry and Ginny married around 2002. They lived at Godric's Hollow for a period, the village where Harry was born and where his parents were buried, before eventually moving to a home large enough for the family they were building. Ginny played professional Quidditch for the Holyhead Harpies during the early years of their marriage. Harry, meanwhile, had joined the Auror office straight after the war, and by 26 was already running the entire department, making him the youngest person to ever hold that position in Ministry history. So, while Ginny was one of the most recognizable athletes in Britain, Harry was the most powerful law enforcement official in the country. Their household was busy in a way that probably felt like the opposite of the quiet, lonely years Harry spent growing up. They had 3 children, and the way Harry named them tells you where his head was even years after the war. James Sirius after his father and his godfather, Albus Severus after Dumbledore and Snape, 2 men whose legacies took most of his life to fully understand. Each name a tribute to someone he lost, deeply moving and also a considerable amount of pressure to put on children who just want to go to school and, have a normal life. Albus Severus Potter had to introduce himself for 7 years at Hogwarts. That alone deserves acknowledgement. James Sirius Scorpius, the oldest, came out exactly the way you would expect a child of Harry and Ginny to turn out. Confident, a little reckless, and completely unbothered by the pressure of the family name. Sorted into Gryffindor, made the Quidditch team, and spent most of his Hogwarts years being a very successful version of his grandfather James. Harry probably had complicated feelings about that on a daily basis. Then there was Albus Severus. Sorted into Slytherin, something Harry had technically told him was fine, but was probably still not fully prepared for when it actually happened. Albus befriended Scorpius Malfoy within the first hour at Hogwarts. Yes, Draco's son. We'll get to him in a minute, and spent the next several years struggling under the weight of being Harry Potter's son in a house that was not Gryffindor. Harry, having grown up desperate for exactly the kind of family Albus was born into, genuinely could not understand why his son felt like an outsider in it. Two people who clearly loved each other, consistently talking past each other for years. That is the most human storyline in the entire wizarding world, and the one the movies never got to tell. And Lily Luna the youngest. There's not much documented about her beyond the epilogue. Frustrating because she carries two extraordinary names and presumably grew up watching her father run the Auror office and her mother cover Quidditch World Cups. What we do know is that she was sorted into Gryffindor, and by all accounts had the warmth both her namesakes were known for. Sometimes the quietest member of a family is just the one who turned out fine without needing a story told about them. Lily Luna Potter seems like she turned out fine. Voldemort and Bellatrix. Now this one requires a disclaimer up front. Delphine Riddle, the daughter of Voldemort, and Bellatrix Lestrange comes from Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. Whether you consider that canon is a conversation the fandom has been having since 2016 without resolution. We are including it because the story is genuinely fascinating, and because a secret child of the two most feared dark wizards in history is not something worth skipping past. Delphine was conceived before the Battle of Hogwarts and born in secret at Malfoy Manor, with Astoria Greengrass's parents acting as guardians. Bellatrix died at the Battle of Hogwarts without ever publicly acknowledging her existence, and Voldemort died the same day without knowing she existed at all, meaning Delphine grew up completely alone, raised by guardians who eventually died and left her with nothing but the most dangerous family legacy in wizarding history, and a desperate need to use it. Unsurprisingly, she inherited Voldemort's Parseltongue ability and his capacity for ruthlessness, and spent her early life building toward a plan to travel back in time and prevent the prophecy from unfolding, saving Voldemort before Harry could defeat him. The plan failed. She was captured and sentenced to Azkaban for life. What makes Delphine's story genuinely uncomfortable is not the dark magic or the time travel. It is that she was a child who grew up with no family, no love, and an identity constructed entirely around a father who never knew she existed, and a cause that had already failed before she was old enough to understand it. She was raised to be a weapon for a war that was already over. In a different set of circumstances, with different people around her from the beginning, the story could have gone somewhere else entirely. It did not. But the question of what she might have been lingers in a way that most Harry Potter villains simply do not. Voldemort spent his entire existence running from death, splitting his soul, destroying the people around him in pursuit of immortality. His legacy turned out to be a daughter he never knew, raised in isolation, sentenced to life in Azkaban before she was fully grown. For a man who wanted to live forever, that is a particularly bleak version of what he left behind. Draco and Astoria Malfoy. Draco Malfoy came out of the war with his family name in ruins and spent the years that followed trying to figure out what kind of person he actually wanted to be, when the ideology he had been raised on was no longer available as an identity. He married Astoria Greengrass, a pure-blood witch from a respectable family who had looked at blood supremacy, grown up surrounded by it, and rejected it completely. Good. She brought that rejection directly into Malfoy Manor, causing significant tension with Lucius and Narcissa, particularly Lucius, for whom Astoria's attitude toward blood purity was a daily personal insult delivered at his own dining table. They had one son, Scorpius, and Draco made a deliberate decision to raise him differently. Kindness toward Muggleborns. Genuine decency as a baseline rather than a performance. None of the ideology that had defined the Malfoy name for generations. It was a quiet but complete repudiation of his father's legacy, done not through speeches but through how he showed up as a parent day after day. Then Astoria died. A hereditary blood curse had weakened her health throughout her life, and eventually it took her, leaving Draco to raise Scorpius alone in Malfoy Manor, a house that had once been Voldemort's headquarters and was now just a father and his son rattling around in rooms full of portraits that disapproved of the direction of the family had taken. Scorpius grew up kind, thoughtful, and acutely aware of what strangers assumed about him before he opened his mouth. He arrived at Hogwarts already carrying the Malfoy name like a warning sign, and as we mentioned earlier, his very first friend there was Albus Potter. Draco, to his credit, let it happen. Lucius presumably needed to sit down for quite some time when he found out. That friendship between the son Draco raised to be better and the son Harry raised to carry the weight of two complicated names was the thing nobody from either family saw coming, and arguably the most quietly hopeful detail the post-war wizarding world produced. Neville and Hannah Longbottom. Neville Longbottom and Hannah Abbott never had biological children of their own, a detail the wizarding world tends to move past fairly quickly, given all Neville accomplished. But the absence of biological children did not mean the absence of family, and his post-war story is one of the most quietly complete in the series. Neville was named godfather to Albus Severus Potter, Harry's middle son, the one who sorted into Slytherin, the one struggling under the weight of a famous name in an unexpected house. The boy who spent most of his Hogwarts years being overlooked ended up as a guiding presence for a child dealing with a very different but equally complicated version of not quite fitting in. That connection is one of the more meaningful details in the post-war wizarding world. Two people from completely different generations linked by the experience of feeling like they did not belong where people expected them to. Hannah became the landlady of the Leaky Cauldron after the war, running it with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had survived a battle and was not about to be intimidated by a difficult customer. She later took over as Hogwarts matron when Madame Pomfrey retired in 2014, meaning at one point she and Neville were both working at Hogwarts simultaneously while also managing a pub in London. The logistics of that schedule alone deserve some kind of recognition. Neville taught herbology under McGonagall, the woman who had watched him struggle through 6 years of her transfiguration classes, and eventually became head of Gryffindor House, the same house that once watched him get his legs jinxed by Draco Malfoy in a corridor, the same house where he had spent years being the student people forgot about, became the house he was responsible for shaping. He sometimes showed students his enchanted Dumbledore's army coin during lessons, a casual reminder that he had helped bring down a Dark Lord before settling into a career growing plants and inspiring teenagers. So yeah, for two people who never had children of their own, Neville and Hannah built one of the most complete and satisfying post-war lives in the series. An herbology professor and a pub landlady living above the Leaky Cauldron? No grand gestures, no dramatic legacy, just two people who found their purpose and built something steady around it. Honestly, perfect ending. Luna and Rolf Scamander. In case you were wondering what happened to the girl who spent school searching for creatures nobody else believed in, she married Rolf Scamander, grandson of Newt Scamander, had twin sons, and spent her post-war years traveling the world doing exactly what she had always wanted. But Luna Lovegood waited until later in life to start her family, meaning her children arrived after the Potter and Weasley kids were already well established at Hogwarts. She and Rolf had twin sons, Lorcan and Lysander, and raised them in an environment where being unconventional was not just tolerated but actively celebrated, a household where the strange was the baseline, and normal was something that happened to other families. Both boys grew up essentially on the road, their parents traveling the world documenting magical creatures, meaning Lorcan and Lysander had a childhood that looked nothing like their peers at Hogwarts, while James Potter was causing chaos at a Scottish castle, and Rose Weasley was terrifying her professors with the depth of her revision notes. The Scamander twins were somewhere in the field with parents who considered a dangerous magical creature a Tuesday. That kind of upbringing either produces remarkably grounded people or remarkably ungrounded ones, given their parents probably both simultaneously. But the bad news, Luna never found the crumple-horned Snorkack, a fact she apparently accepted with complete serenity and zero regret. She did discover and properly document entirely new magical species, expanding wizarding knowledge in ways nobody else had thought to try. The girl people dismissed as strange turned out to be a genuine pioneer, and her sons grew up knowing that version of her rather than the one that Hogwarts classmates had spent years underestimating. Rolf's connection to Newt Scamander meant the boys carried an extraordinary double legacy. Luna's fearless curiosity on one side and one of the most celebrated Magizoologist families in wizarding history on the other. Lorcan and Lysander Scamander grew up at the intersection of two traditions that valued the natural magical world above almost anything else, raised by two people who chose wonder over convention at any available opportunity. Whatever they became, they had a foundation unlike anyone else in their generation. George and Angelina Weasley. George Weasley lost Fred at the Battle of Hogwarts and then kept going anyway, building something out of the wreckage that honored what he had lost without being consumed consumed by it. That's either the bravest thing anyone did in the aftermath of the war or the most heartbreaking. And the honest answer is probably both at once. He married Angelina Johnson, who had previously dated Fred, a fact that the extended Weasley family processed in the way British families process complicated emotional situations. Through casseroles, silence, and a collective decision never to bring it up directly. Grief and love do not follow neat rules, and George and Angelina had both loved the same person and lost him in the same moment. What they built together came out of that shared loss rather than despite it, and there is something in that worth acknowledging. They had 2 children, a daughter named Roxanne and a son named Fred. Some things you carry forward regardless of the cost, because letting them disappear is not an option you are willing to consider. Fred Weasley II grew up with his uncle's name and his father's humor, in a household built on the philosophy that laughter was never just comedy, but a way of surviving the unbearable and insisting on joy anyway. Roxanne grew up alongside him, less documented but shaped by the same foundation. Both children inherited a legacy simultaneously about grief and about refusing to be defined by it. A complicated thing to grow up inside and also a remarkable one. Weasley's Wizard Wheezies thrived in the post-war years, spreading products across the wizarding world and into classrooms everywhere. And George carried Fred forward not just in name, but in every joke, every product, and every time someone laughed because of something he made. Percy and Audrey Weasley. Percy Weasley spent years choosing the Ministry over his own family, watched that ministry collapse under a Dark Lord, showed up to the Battle of Hogwarts, cracked a joke mid-battle that shocked his entire family into momentary silence, and finally got it right. The single joke did more for his family relationships than anything he had managed in the previous decade, which is either funny or slightly depressing depending on how generously you want to read it. He married Audrey, about whom Rowling has revealed almost nothing publicly. Audrey married into the most chaotic family in Wizarding Britain, raised 2 daughters, maintained a career, and managed to remain entirely undocumented in any official source. A feat that in the Weasley family genuinely requires effort. She either possessed the patience of an absolute saint or had a genuine appreciation for ministry transportation regulations discussed at dinner, possibly both. The mystery of Audrey Weasley is honestly one of the more entertaining loose ends in post-war wizarding history. Their daughters were named Molly and Lucy, the eldest after Percy's mother, a choice that said a great deal about how far he had come from the man who once sent his family a letter suggesting they distanced themselves from Harry Potter for their own safety. Percy rose to head of the Department of Magical Transportation under Kingsley Shacklebolt, steady and respectable and exactly the career Percy was always going to have regardless of what happened around him. Both girls grew up in a household where their father had learned, slowly and at a considerable personal cost, that belonging to people mattered more than institutional loyalty. The Weasley name meant something different in Percy's house than it did anywhere else in the family. In the Burrow, it was inherited and assumed. In Percy's home, it had been nearly thrown away and then chosen again, deliberately, after years of getting it wrong. That distinction shaped how Molly and Lucy understood what family actually meant, even if Percy himself never quite found the words to explain it to them directly. Bill and Fleur Weasley. Bill and Fleur built what is arguably the most internationally connected and genuinely stable household in the Weasley family, combining Weasley stubbornness with Vila elegance in a home at Shell Cottage that was probably spectacular and chaotic in equal measure, and almost certainly had exceptional food. They had 3 children. Victoire, their eldest, became the first member of the next generation to make Wizarding World headlines, though not for anything academic or professional. James Potter spotted her kissing Teddy Lupin at platform 9 3/4, and immediately reported this to anyone within hearing distance, because James Potter is constitutionally incapable of minding his own business. Victoire was named after the French word for victory, born on the anniversary of the Battle of Hogwarts, a detail connecting her birth to the war her parents both fought in before she existed. Dominique and Louis, their younger children, are considerably less documented in official sources. What is confirmed is that all 3 carried both Weasley and Vila heritage, a combination that according to fan theory produced some of the most striking students Hogwarts had seen in a generation. Bill continued working as a cursebreaker for Gringotts after the war, occasionally traveling abroad but always returning to Shell Cottage. Fleur was decorated by the French Ministry of Magic for her wartime bravery and chose family life over further public recognition, raising 3 children in a home that blended 2 cultures, 2 languages, and 2 very different ideas about how food should be prepared. People spent years underestimating Fleur Delacour because she was beautiful and French and therefore assumed to be decorative, conveniently ignoring that she had competed against dragons and merpeople at 15 13, and stayed loyal to Bill after a werewolf attack that would have sent most people running. Post-war, she simply chose where her life was going. The children she raised at Shell Cottage grew up at the intersection of two proud wizarding traditions, with a mother decorated for bravery and a father who broke curses for a living. That is a fairly extraordinary baseline for three kids who mostly got written out of the story before it ended. Teddy Lupin and Victoire Weasley. Teddy Lupin grew up knowing his parents only through stories, photographs, and the people who loved them. Remus and Tonks both died at the Battle of Hogwarts when Teddy was less than a month old, leaving him to be raised by his grandmother Andromeda in a house that had once been full and was suddenly very quiet. Harry took the godfather role seriously from the beginning, showing up consistently throughout Teddy's childhood in a way that ensured he understood what family felt like even without the two people most central to his. He inherited his mother's metamorph magus abilities, meaning he could change his appearance entirely at will, a gift that as a teenager was either the most useful thing imaginable or an absolute disaster depending on the day and the context. He grew up embedded in the Potter and Weasley families, present at gatherings included in holidays, treated as part of something larger than the loss he had been born into. By his Hogwarts years, Teddy had developed a romantic interest in Victoire Weasley, Bill and Fleur's eldest daughter, and was reportedly changing his hair color to match her favorite shade at the time, a detail so specifically romantic that Tonks would have found it either adorable or deeply embarrassing. The relationship became public knowledge not through any quiet conversation or family announcement, but because James Sirius Potter, 11 years old and constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, spotted them kissing at platform 9 3/4, and like we said earlier, told absolutely everyone about it. Teddy and Victoire's relationship linked the Lupin and Weasley families and the next generation in a way that connected two Order of the Phoenix members' legacies through their children. Remus and Tonks would have found that either completely wonderful or mildly overwhelming. The symbolism of it, two families shaped by the same war finding their way to each other a generation later, is one of the more quietly hopeful details the wizarding world produced. But what about the 10 legendary wizarding schools the Harry Potter movies never fully explained? That's your next lesson here at Stickman Hogwarts. Click now before Delphini messes up your timeline too.